welcome everyone to Becoming America series. This is a series of 17 conversations with experts and authors about the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which actually drafted the Constitution that we live under today. With me are my two co-hosts. We have Judge Jim Gray, the judge, Bijan Kian, the American, and I'm Joellen Chatham. For no other reason, I'm called the professor. We begin each one of our shows with a song, and after that song, we have a conversation. And today our conversation is with Dr. Larry Arnn, and we'll tell you a little bit more about him in just a few minutes. But first, the song. Judge Jim Gray and his two co-composers, Joel Henry Stein and Stephen Lawless, wrote a musical called Convention, The Birth of America. And so we begin each one of our programs with one of those songs. So Jim, tell us about the song today, Overthrowing the Government. That's a little bit radical, isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. And we'll learn more from Dr. Arnn as we go, but thank you, Joellen, and or doctor, professor, all of that. But yes, the first of our songs, this is the third session. The first was, of course, the introduction, and that's what we did. The second was Off to Philadelphia, and it set the scene. It set kind of the whole idea, the times of what was going on. This will be the first one that's really substantive. And there was just a great deal of concern that, look, we fought this revolution to overthrow that tyrant, George III. We do not want to bring in another tyrant. We do not want a strong central government. The Articles of Confederation, of course, was anything but strong. And that's why they gathered, because it just wasn't working. But and one thing that got me in my research with regard to composing the musical was that with the Articles of Confederation, the term United States of America was considered to be plural. But after the Constitutional Convention, when we brought in our new Constitution, the term United States of America was determined to be singular. And I think that says a great deal. But we had a lot of people, very patriotic, that were called anti-federalists. We do not want to have a strong federal government. We want to leave the power for the states and the people, all of which was fine. And in many ways, they were right. But they were not just from the South. Many of them, like Roger Sherman, real big spokesperson. He was from Connecticut. Luther Martin was from Maryland. So we had these people that were really concerned that we were going to overthrow that government. And we'll talk to Dr. Arnn about that. And basically, that's what happened. I think the statute of limitations is run by now, but they did overthrow the Articles of Confederation by bringing this in. You mentioned Benjamin Franklin, which you should. He was our moderator. And boy, what a man. He was 81 years old at the time, when the standard average life expectancy in the United States was mid-30s. So he was obviously revered, obviously considered to be a philosopher. And throughout our musical, as you will see, he'll throw in these asides. And at the beginning, the delegates were, wow, that's really smart. Wow, that's really something. But pretty soon they start, oh, here he goes again. And at the end of the musical, they kind of roll their eyes like, oh, God, help us from this. But he was saying at the beginning that there were many delegates at the Constitutional Convention, and they were well educated, they were experienced, and sometimes with all the ego that goes with it. And then he says off to an aside to us, of course, the proud hate pride, but only in other people. And so with that, we have the Articles of Confederation are up for grabs. We had actually Patrick Henry had been elected to be a delegate. He smelled a rat. He felt that they were going to overthrow the government, so he didn't even go. So Governor Morris was a spokesperson for the Federalist side, and he was listening to Roger Sherman saying, well, sure, the articles can grow. We know that they must emerge corrected and enlarged. And Morris said, what's that again? Yeah, corrected and enlarged. And they used that term in effect to go against the anti-federalists, saying all we're doing is correcting and enlarging the articles. But in effect, that's exquisite. Let's carry on. So this is the song, Overthrow the Government. It kind of leads into this whole deal. Let's listen to the song.
The articles, they've served us all so well. And now I fear they'd really like to send them straight to hell. We've got to find some talking points to really make them sell. The Articles of Confederation, just need some time to gel. They want to overthrow the government we worked so hard to build. We and all the others never meant to have it killed. Sure, it needs some patching and some tweaking on page 8, but heck, we didn't travel here to see it blow up as its fate.
The articles are best reduced to particles of paper to be swept up off the floor. As for Confederation, we need a solid nation where loosey-goose and wishy-wash no more.
We defend the status quo, and sure the articles can grow. We know they must emerge corrected and enlarged, but we'll turn back any effort.
The articles, they have some good ideas. If you learn to read between the lines, I'm sure that you can see 'em.
So the question is, was the government overthrown? And Dr. Larry Arnn is going to help answer that question. Dr. Larry Arnn is the 12th president of Hillsdale College. And unlike many college professors or presidents, he also teaches courses in history and politics. He received his bachelor's degree from Arkansas State University and his master's degree and PhD from the Claremont Graduate School in Southern California. He also studies at Worcester College at Oxford University in England. And I think it's rather impressive if you ever read Sir Martin Gilbert's volumes, his biography of Winston Churchill, which is the official biography. Well, Dr. Arnn was the director of research for that project. He was also president of the Claremont Institute in Southern California from 1985 to 2000. The Claremont Institute is very much involved in teaching and exploring and researching about America's founding. And it's actually an institute for the study of statesmanship and political philosophy. He's on a number of boards, very important ones, such as Henry Salvatori Center at the Claremont McKenna College, the Heritage Foundation, the Claremont Institute, and many others. What I found particularly interesting about your biography, Dr. Arnn, is that you were with the U.S. Army War College Board of Visitors for 2 years, and you received the Department of the Army's Outstanding Civil Service Award. That's pretty impressive. You recently chaired the 1776 Commission, which was offered by the President of the United States, encouraging schools and colleges to teach the founding documents of our country. And you issued a report, which can be found online just by looking under 1776 Commission. He's the author of 3 books, including Churchill's Trial, Winston Churchill, and the Salvation of Free Government. So welcome to our program. All 3 of us have known you for many years, and it's just a delight to have you with us. And Bijan, I think you want to ask the first question.
The question is a 2-part question. What was that government? And was it organized under the Articles of Confederation? If so, these were very smart people who drafted the Articles. Did they realize they're creating an impossible document at the time they were doing that? And tell us a little bit about the Articles, how they were formed, and what was the thinking behind it? It was an impossible document. No decisions could be made. Did they know that when they did that? And how did they deal with that? What was that government like to be overthrown?
Well, some of them knew that it was a mess, and it was the best they could do at the time. You have to understand about America, that it's an unprecedented series of things. There's never been a government formed the way ours was, but at least up until the time of our government. And they formed the Articles of Confederation, and the full title of the Articles is a very important point, is the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. That means that they gave up the idea that they were independent, but most of them didn't think of that. Then anyway, Abraham Lincoln says in his first inaugural address that they had a common bond already because they were all subject to the British Crown before they declared their independence from that. And that was a real revolution. That was throwing off the government by force. And this comes along, and this is, so first of all, they wrote the Articles of Confederation in the Confederation Congress, which, was formed and proceeding without any governing instrument. And they wrote it up and they passed it. And they did that in the middle of a war, which war, by the way, they were losing. Mm-hmm. And so they put together what they could. And and as you say, it didn't work. And it didn't work for a lot of reasons. One of them was there wasn't any executive. That means it couldn't act. It couldn't, because, that word executive is cognate with the word execute. It sometimes involves killing people. And you have to do that, to preserve a nation. And they just weren't capable of acting that way. The Congress could only requisite, it's just a unicameral Congress with one vote for every state. And they could only get money by requisitioning it from the states. And then the states didn't send it. Because why would they? There's only any way to make them. And so they were broke. And the British, it was a taunt. It was an outrage and a scandal. The British kept troops on land that we had won by conquest from them in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, with the end of the Revolutionary War. And they were just still there. And, even as late as George Washington's administration, he sent Benedict Arnold out with a force to subdue some rum runners in Ohio, the Ohio Territory, Northwest Territory. And he did subdue them, but then he chased them up to the river, on the other side of which was near Detroit. Detroit is in Wayne County today. And there were British troops on the other side, and he dare not go across. You see, so the thing was, it was ridiculous, and there was a consensus that we're going to have to do something. We're going to do better than that. This is not a workable government. And I'll mention one last thing. And if you want to see the reasons for this, the authoritative document is written in 1787 in April. The Constitutional Convention convenes in May. And in April, James Madison, who was not an unimportant figure, published a paper called The Vices of the Political System of the United States. And it's like everything he wrote, it's a beautiful document. And it's got, I'm going to count up how many points there are in it. There are, come on.
And while you're looking, it's not a long document to read.
No.
Some of the things the founders wrote were long. Sermons in those days were long. But this document, you can probably read in about 15 minutes. It's an excellent summary.
There are 11 points in it. And Madison is a compact and logical writer. And he's also capable of great beauty in his writing. But in this document, he says the heart of the matter, by the way, it's a fundamental aspect of American constitutionalism, invented here for the first time, that the Constitution is superior to the laws and rulings of the bodies formed under it. But in order to make that superiority firm, it has to be implemented by a grander authority. And the grandest authority is the people. And so the Articles of Confederation were just passed through the Confederation Congress.
Well, Dr. It seems to me that the Articles was a transitional phase, that had somebody come out in that original convention while we were losing the war and said, oh, we need a strong executive. Oh, we need three branches of government. Oh, we have to have a Supreme Court to oversee our laws. They would have been laughed out. They probably would have taken up arms against them. Didn't we have to go through that transition and then see how simply it wasn't working if we couldn't pay our bills and protect ourselves?
Well, the thought, that's a good point. And one must forgive them, right? Look what they were trying to do. I mean, it's darn near impossible and almost didn't work. But the knowledge existed of how to form this kind of constitution because the founders had been thinking about that for a long time. Although in the 11 years between the Declaration and the Constitutional Convention, they thought about it a lot harder. So yeah, it wasn't just that they learned by doing. It wasn't just that they didn't know. It was that, how are you going to do that? Like, you're in this Congress. The Congress is just, the Congress of the United States in the Revolution. The Revolution started with people I think this is going on in our country right now, and I pray so. People are very upset. And the people got really upset, and then they started writing letters to each other. And the next thing you know, they've got some kind of a plan, and then they send a bunch of representatives somewhere. That's the first Congress. And the Articles of Confederation was written by that Congress. And so, yeah, they didn't, like if you said, we need an executive, well, that would immediately raise the question, how are we going to appoint one? And, that's the subject of much debate, a month of debate in the summer of 1787 in the Constitutional Convention. So, yeah, they weren't capable of it in the circumstances in which they were.
Well, I think we have to remember that at that time, during the Articles and before, that every state had its own executive. They had their own legislature. They had their own judicial branch. So they already had it, but how to consolidate that into one national government was the problem. It was the issue. And in fact, at the convention, the delegates in many of the states were authorized not to craft a new government and a new constitution. They were authorized to amend the articles to make them better. But that's not what they did. What brought them to what changed that, Dr. Arnn, to make them just leave the articles behind and go beyond amending them?
Corrected and enlarged, Doctor?
Yeah, well, first of all, James Madison answers that question specifically and artfully too. He says, there's just degrees of amendment. So we amended it a lot. I mean, it looks entirely different.
That's for sure.
And who's to say when you stop amending and you start creating new? And then it's the one place in the whole Federalist Papers where this happens. He immediately turns to the Declaration of Independence. And he says, under our principles, the people have the right to form the government they want. And so their ultimate defense against that charge was they did submit it to the people for ratification. And so that's how they reconciled that.
That's right.
But you're right, they did. People today are all for these Article 5 conventions because they're going to fix everything, they think, and I'm dubious about it. But and they'll say, well, you can confine it so they won't run away. And I said, you're going to confine it better than it was confined in 1787? Because that was pretty good, the safeguards they had in place.
Now,
So, Dr. Arnn, there was probably a number of factors leading to the convention, and they were all contributed to that event, very important event in our history, take place. Shays' Rebellion, what was its contribution to the Constitutional Convention? Did it have a significant impact? Did it bring a practical wake-up call? Was it like that, or it was just?
Oh yeah, no, it was a big deal. It was a big deal. It was in Massachusetts, and what it was first of all, the currency wasn't any good. It varied from state to state, and it wasn't very good in any state. And left to your own devices, are you going to pay your debts? And especially in a system where there's a lot of chaos around, right? And so what Daniel Shays did, he's a military veteran and he was, a heck of a guy, is that he started organizing to disrupt banks foreclosing on farms and disrupting the meeting of courts to force those foreclosures. So it was a direct assault on the law. And, you can, if you don't pay your debts, every time somebody gets off not doing that, somebody else gets hurt, and there's a breaking of a contract going on in there. So the founders were, people in general were appalled by that. And, today even I think people would be appalled by that, because one of the effects of that is you won't be able to borrow any money. And so the point was there was an emergency there. There were many such emergencies going on.
Doctor, the rebellion was from the very same troops that fought for us in the Revolutionary War, but they had not been paid for their services. So that was a breach of contract as well. Of course, you say the government didn't have any money to pay them, which was also true. And why should the state of, Rhode Island or something pay them? So there was no government in a lot of ways. And they finally, why should we be put out of our farms for not paying our bills when we're not being paid? So I regret to say, I'm embarrassed to say, I was a U.S. history major in college, and I didn't even know what the Shays Rebellion was, particularly until I started doing my research for this, but it was a big deal.
Oh yeah, huge, huge. And that whole thing about, credit, that word credit comes from a Latin word for faith. And if the credit of the nation breaks down, that's a very general problem. And, the troops. So, one of the ways the Constitution fixed this, by the way, was right after it come into place, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, got the bonds issued to win the Revolutionary War. And they stunk to high heaven, these bonds, because they were issued at a face value and people who owned them had bought them on pennies on the dollar. And he got them funded in full. And that meant, wow, now this government's going to pay its debts. And then the government can borrow money. And then the currency will be stable and other people can borrow money and people can work and grow. And that's one of the things the Constitution of the United States corrected.
Well, you can jump forward a little bit. Alexander Hamilton, of course, was Washington's right-hand man. And after when he was forming his government, he asked President Washington, do you want to be Secretary of State or Secretary of the Treasury? No question about it. He became Secretary of the Treasury. And he almost single-handedly saved our monetary system the way I read it. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, there was a consensus among the founders of the country that the country was going to be on the gold standard. And Robert Morris had a lot to do with fixing the currency. And he thought up a way to do it. There's some really beautiful documents about it from him. And what the documents basically say is, not only are we going to be on the gold standard, but the way we're going to set up the circulation of gold is that the system will pay for itself. The government will get a little bit from the issue of each stock of gold, not much, and that'll be enough. And so it won't need any taxes to support it either.
Well, what's interesting with all of this is that the things that we're talking about, putting down rebellion requires a national government that can do that, coining money, regulating interstate commerce, having a national currency because the states have their own currency or their own ways of inaugurating credit and so on. So the Constitution filled in a lot of these gaps. It actually created a real national government. Dr. Arnn, let me ask, with all of these changes, creating a real government with real power, but leaving some power to the states, I have two questions. One, what do you think was the most important decision that was made at Philadelphia in 1787? And secondly, what about the powers left to the states? Has that been eroded in recent times?
Yeah, it's devastating. So first of all, the Constitution of the United States did centralize powers in the central government in some ways, but it also devolved them in other ways. And what it made was a system that was elaborated. And this is described beautifully in the Federalist Papers, which is, by the way, one of the most important political documents and profound political documents in modern history. And it was written as 85 campaign tracts. So how did it elaborate the system? Well, first of all, the states, the repository of what's called the police power, the general authority of the government to legislate for the health and welfare of the society, that remains in the states. And the federal government doesn't get that. It doesn't have it today, although it breaches that limit all the time. And that means that there are only these enumerated powers in the Constitution. And those powers are in Article 1, Section 8, and there are 17 paragraphs, and they break down into three parts. And they're just three main jobs of the federal government. About half of them are for national defense. Most of the rest are about a national system of commerce, of trade without regard to free state lines, of a national stable currency, of bankruptcy laws so that debtors can get out of debt by a process that's legal and protects the creditors. And so, and money, coin money. And those are what the federal government's supposed to be doing. And it's actually not supposed to be running the schools, but it does that a lot now. So that means that, and see, the states get in some ways stronger, because if you've now got two meaningful levels of government, then you can arrange the powers among them in a better way, a more complex way, to have a stronger separation of powers. And so they wanted a stronger government, but they wanted a safer government with the same breath. And that's, one of the great feats of political science, in my opinion, is the building of the Constitution of the United States. And there's nothing else like it. It's lasted longer than any other.
Well, Doctor, there was a substantial movement, of course, to have a Bill of Rights, but there was a substantial opposition to that as well, saying, just like you said, Article 1, Section 8, all of this power remains with the people unless it's delegated by this instrument, by this Constitution, to the federal government. So if we start saying, well, the government can't do this and cannot do that, then if we don't mention something, maybe the government can. And I think in many ways that was a fairly strong argument. Do you agree?
Oh, yeah. Well, Madison and Hamilton both agreed about that very much. And it's a kind of a lovely story, because when the Constitution was ratified, it was kind of tricky, because the convention said that when 9 states ratify, then it goes into effect. And that means, by the way, the 9 could effectively be seceding from the other 4. That is a point that is made in the South Carolina secession message in 1861. And they did that because they didn't think they'd get it through. And then it gets ratified by 7 states really fast. But the holdouts were the big boys: Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia. And it just so happens that James Madison was from Virginia, and Patrick Henry, an enemy of and George Mason, who opposed the Constitution, were from Virginia. So you got titans arguing there. And then Alexander Hamilton is from New York. And then the decisive person in Massachusetts came out to be John Hancock, an ancient elder statesman. And those all passed it narrowly. And then they did something big, something that shows that there was a basic trust operating in the society, because all 3 of those states negotiated deals with Hamilton and Madison and Hancock that they would give their word that they would put through a Bill of Rights. They didn't say you have to do it and then we ratify. We just need your word. And remember, if you're New York, you've got port control. Those are big states. They've got huge interest. None of them asked for anything to serve their interest. They asked for a Bill of Rights. And that just shows, there's a harmony of opinion about that kind of thing.
We talk about overthrowing the government. And by the way, that's the name of this session. We did overthrow the government to the degree that the Articles of Confederation said there can be no amendment unless all 13 states ratify it. Now we're going down to 9 states. So that was certainly a fundamental change. Whether you'd call that an overthrow, I'll leave to historians.
No, but see, that's a very good point. But on the other hand, we tidied that up, didn't we? All 13 ratified. Took Rhode Island a long time. But see that, the founding of America is the most coherent and tidy series of political events in history. It's just, they're not tidy or coherent in all cases. They're human things. And at every stage, because the story of the Constitutional Convention itself, they showed up with fundamental disagreements. Madison and Hamilton, later political enemies, never personal enemies, but political enemies, they arrived proposing that the federal government be empowered to act in all cases whatsoever. And they gave that up. That's one of the big compromises, right? And then they figured out, the heart of the constitutional system, according to James Madison in the 63rd Federalist. The unique thing about it is that it's the first constitutional safeguard. In our country, the people are sovereign, but they don't form any part of the government. And so all of the power to do is in the government, and all of the authority for doing is outside the government. And so the first separation of powers is that. And of course, I will say that it's my belief that it makes it dangerous, because at the time they were writing all this, the government, state, federal, and local, and it was skewed heavily. Local most, state second, federal third. That was like 7% of the economy. Now it's about 53%, right? And that means that huge powers have moved inside the government. And that means we poor people out here who are just civilians, what do we matter, right? So I think that's the danger of our time. And the Constitution is vulnerable to that because of that feature that also made it stable for so long.
Dr. Arnn, we read about George Mason insisting on creation of Bill of Rights. We also read that some of the delegates were adamant against, they were arguing against creation of Bill of Rights. And we read that some said that it would be harmful. What was their argument? What did they think would be so harmful in creating the Bill of Rights? And finally, how was that argument resolved? How was the counter argument against the harmfulness of Bill of Rights won by George Mason and the other two delegates?
Well, first of all, the warning was these will be taken to be the only ones, and there are others, right? And then a warning was if you breach that and admit that there are others, then you'll be making them up wholesale, which is what we do today. So they don't like it. Now, how did they settle it? I mean, first of all, they're wonderful. James Madison wrote them more than anybody else. And the Ninth Amendment makes explicit that if it's not specifically delegated, it belongs to the states and the people of the states, not the federal government, right? So tie goes to the local. And then the 10th says, now the 9th says the enumeration of these rights doesn't mean there are not others. And the 10th says tie goes to the local. And that's how they resolved that argument, right? In other words, they both got what they wanted. It's just that we have in America today lost the ability to read. And if you would read the dang document, you could see what it says.
Does this not prove some of what the Anti-Federalists said? I know there was concern about loose language in places, such as Congress having the power to care for the general welfare of the people, whatever that means, and that Congress has the power to do whatever is necessary and proper to carry into the other powers. There was loose language, and there was concern about that. And today, when we look back, we can say, why does the federal government engage in education, for example? Why does the federal government do a lot of things that are not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, and are states losing their authority, even though we have the 10th Amendment?
So that's the General Welfare Clause, which is in Article 1, Section 8. Mm-hmm. And what it says is that Congress has the power to tax for the general welfare of the United States. James Madison later wrote that that was a badly written passage, because what it meant, and it's exactly parallel to an article that's in the Articles of Confederation, what that meant was legitimate debts of the whole Union, even if they're owed by the states, can be paid by the federal government. So it's a transition passage. Now, it's also true that the courts, they've worked, the courts and the Congress and the executive branch have been in a competition to see who can screw up the Constitution the most. But the courts have not really relied on that one to expand the powers of the federal government, they've relied on the Commerce Clause and the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. And they've, so they open loopholes big enough to drive a truck through that mostly don't drive through that particular provision. But James Madison agrees with you that that was not a good passage. And, it was copied, right? So it was really clear in 1777, when they wrote the Articles of Confederation, the federal government didn't have any power to tax anyway. And so to lift it up and put it in the new one, it could make mischief. And it has made some, but the mischief has come from more general clauses.
Now, Dr. Arnn, I'm going to represent the judiciary here and say that we all know that judges don't make laws, they just interpret them. So that's been, their interpretations have been maybe a bit different on occasion.
Yeah. We know about those judges.
But let me get into a specific issue with you, that one of the problems that we were facing, which caused the Constitutional Convention to be brought into play in 1787, was that some of the states started having their own treaties with various countries, because the other countries didn't know who they were dealing with. But they did also start to put in embargoes between goods from Virginia going into Philadelphia, into Pennsylvania, for example. So they had the wisdom in the Constitution to say no states will put up tariffs against other states in our country. My question to you is, it was a lot harder probably for Virginia to trade with Pennsylvania back in 1787 than it is the United States to trade with Germany or China today. Don't tariffs harm the world just like they would have harmed our country when it was growing up, in your view?
Well, I love Winston Churchill, and he was a free trader. And I love Abe Lincoln and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and James Madison, and they were protectionists. And that means the natural law does not speak to me on that issue. I myself think that the economic arguments about division of labor on a global scale are dispositive. But I think you also, you can learn, by the way, from the compromises in the life of Winston Churchill that this is true. You have to judge that, right? And so, Milton Friedman was a friend of mine for 35 years. I used to argue with him about this. And I would say, Milton, what do you think? Should we let the Russians build all our submarines if they'll build them cheaper? And, and that means you say, well, no. And I said, is that an important exception? Because if an interest of the nation, so it's a prudential matter. You certainly should have broadly free trade, no question about it. I think what Trump did myself was he just used a stick to get us some better deals that resulted in freer trade. And I think that was his object, but that's controversial.
Larry, today, people don't read the Constitution. All of the surveys that are done show that people don't know what's in the Constitution, and yet it's the supreme law of the land. It's our foundational document. Many parts of the Constitution that seem obscure are becoming important today. For example, the states are supposed to run the elections for federal offices, but the Congress can step in. And now there's legislation which would basically federalize all of our national elections. The size of the national, the seat of government, Washington, D.C., is subject now to being considered to be a state. And yet the Constitution requires that we have a seat of government. So how do we balance those, making it a state versus the seat of government? It can't be both at the same time. There's so much that is happening in our country today. But the electoral college, another one, people want to abolish the electoral college, but they have no idea how it works, who the electors are, when they meet, what they do. Oh, but they want to abolish it. You just completed a report for the President of the United States, the 1776 Commission report, that talks about the importance of civic education, of our people understanding the Constitution. Understanding the Constitution is one thing, but the principles behind it, the things that were discussed at the convention and the ratifying conventions, which is what this series is about. Can you tell us why this is so important? We may know it is, But a lot of people think this is just good for the politicians and the political science teachers.
It's a very good point. I personally am pessimistic about the past and optimistic about the future. Mostly that's a hope and a prayer, that second thing, because the point is a bunch of bad stuff is happening now. If you know anything about human nature, you know that a one-party rule is not a good idea, whatever the party.
Yes.
And so we're adjusting the electoral system to help guarantee that. And that's dangerous. And you know, the freedom of speech and freedom of worship, they're being interfered with. Large sections of the country, people have been confined to their homes for months at a time. By the way, in most of the states where that's happened, on the will of the executive branch alone. That's dangerous, right? Well, what I think is going to happen is that people are getting interested. You know, 30,000 people, 20 to 30,000 people went to the 8 of the Lincoln Douglas debates by buckboard and horse and sat in the sun for 4 hours and listened to these two guys argue. And that has never happened since, but it's optimistic. It had also never happened before. It's just that the situation was critical. In the Revolution, the Federalist Papers was written to try to influence the vote in New York. And so they didn't print 1 billion books. I've got an original copy of the Federalist Papers that was given me by my friend Mark Levin, and he paid $400,000 for it. And I think there were 500 of them printed, but they printed the text. They were newspaper articles originally, and they printed the text and they pasted them up in newspaper office windows. And somebody stood in front of them and read them out to the crowd, and huge crowds gathered to hear it. See, so we need a revival of civic education because we're the fundamental constitutional officers in America, and we need to know our jobs. And I'm hopeful that that's what's happening. In my particular line of work, it has just exploded. We have 3 million online students. We have these charter schools. We're starting a curriculum for homeschoolers, the number of whom seems to have tripled in the last 5 years. So people are taking responsibility for themselves because they're a little bit afraid now. And I hope that process will lead to intelligent debate and the arresting of this ruthless growth and accumulation of power in Washington, D.C.
Dr. Arnn, we're only in the 3rd session of 17, but I plan on reading this quote from Thomas Jefferson several times, and I'll begin by quoting it to you. If we are to guard against ignorance and remain free, it is the responsibility of every American to be informed. That's what you said, but in a different way. And I subscribe to that, and it's up to us.
Yeah, I'm a radical. So I always believe in giving action items to everybody. And the action item is always the same. Learn and teach. Talk to people. Correspond. Pick up things. Improve your knowledge. Do it with other people. Because things like that spread like wildfire. And it doesn't matter if Google and Facebook want it to spread like wildfire. There weren't even those things at all in early America, and they just wrote letters and carried them in stagecoaches between cities.
Really? No, I thought that the delegates communicated to each other by their cell phones. Is that not right?
Well, they texted some, that's true.
Or did they change it? Okay.
Massive text campaign. Dr. Arnn, I'm going to ask a brave question. Years from now, maybe some students would be watching this very program, listening to you, scholar, on all matters related to the Constitution of the United States. They will also read about the events of this year, 2020, and they will ask themselves a question. The question would be, was there something missing in the Constitution of the United States that had it been there, we would have had an easier year 2020? In general, as a scholar, do you see, we all pride ourselves. I personally believe it's the greatest document ever written by the hand of man, meaning mankind. any time in the history, and that's a personal pride. But do you see something significant that was missing? If you were one of the delegates like George Mason, what would you argue for and not relent?
First of all, you have to start with the caveat that it's the best and most successful thing of its kind in human history. And so now you're asking me how to make it better. Well, the founders themselves named some things that they would change. I named one of them in this conversation. They're not fundamental things. Because the other thing is, they did what was possible. Of course, they should have got rid of slavery in the Constitution. And they couldn't do that. Not, found in a country. They held it in disfavor is what they did. And you have to also remember, the Constitution of the United States has been subjected to an organized intellectual assault since about 1825. Because John C. Calhoun, the first important American to declare that slavery was a positive good, was a student of students of Francis Lieber, who was a German philosopher and a student of Friedrich Hegel. And he declares the principle that not nature, but history and change is the rule, right? And so, the Constitution, the most important document in America is the Declaration of Independence, which provides the final cause of the nation. The Constitution provides the formal cause, which is the second most, the form. How does it work? What does it look like, right? It's the second most important thing. Well, the Declaration is rooted in the laws of nature and of nature's God. And if you come to think that everything is change, and then you come to think that because modern science, which has demonstrated that to us, can also let us get control of the process of change and remake everything, including ourselves, including the family, including our process of coming to be, including every human relationship, right? That totalitarian idea is, what's killed tens of millions of people, more than that, hundreds of millions of people in the 20th century. And that's rife among us today. Well, if the Constitution is succumbing to that, so will everything else. It'll be the death of civilization itself if it keeps running.
I think one of the most brilliant things that James Madison ever wrote reflected the, I think, very basic understanding that our founders had about human nature. When he said that if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. But we're not angels, so we do need government. But government is composed of people who are not angels. So we not only need to restrain people from our negative impulses, but we have to restrain government as well. And I think that's the balance they tried to achieve in the Constitution, to give a government by the people who were not angels, but a government that the people could control, and all of the checks and balances that were placed into the Constitution really meet that need. We hear a lot about it, and Jim just mentioned the founders, how important knowledge is, and knowledge is extremely important. But I think something that is equally important, the founders emphasized, was virtue, personal as well as civic virtue. It was said that our Constitution was made only for a moral people.
Moral and religious.
Moral, yeah. So I think that's something that we can never forget. Our morality, our personal behavior, our conduct toward each other, toward our fellow man, is extremely important. Even today, that is under assault.
Yeah, well, knowledge you mentioned first. So the virtues in classical thought, which all of the founders had read, divide into the intellectual and the moral. Mm-hmm. And the intellectual virtues are what you know and how you reason about it. And the moral virtues are how you act. And they describe, the greatest book on ethics ever written is Aristotle's Ethics, the first ethics book ever written. It's very beautiful. I teach it every other year here. And what does it say? The virtues put together describe the properly operating and fully functional human being, and only that being can be fully happy. And so we want our children, all of us do. I have a new grandchild, my first grandchild, and she's just ruling the country already, certainly me. And what do I want her to be? I want her to be a good human being, morally and intellectually. And the school should be for that. And we treat the schools as engineering projects now, and it bores the heck out of the students and then corrupts them.
Doctor, on occasion, I would have, as a judge, an opportunity to swear people into various offices, like in the bar associations and the rest. And as you know, you swear them, they will swear to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. And then they say, I will. Then I say, all right, now keep your hand up. Now swear that you'll read the Constitution. And that gets some chuckles from the audience, but it's true. And I'll go so far as to say that it's our government, and if it's not working, it's our fault. It's our responsibility. But let me ask you, because in my research, I determined that, there were 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and they bickered and they debated and they fought about all kinds of things. But see if your research is the same as mine. The function that all 55 delegates believed was the most important function of government was protecting our liberties from the encroachment of government. Number two most important was keeping us safe. Have you encountered that as well? Because how far away have we gotten from that thought of protecting our liberties from the encroachment of government since that time?
Well, you have to, so I would reformulate that a little bit to say that we have to protect it. The purpose of the government is to protect our liberties, and that means from all comers, anybody who would threaten them. And so that means foreign threats, and that means domestic threats, and that means the government itself. That quote that Joe Ellen, that's from the 51st Federalist, men are not angels, angels are not government. That ties the Constitution of the United States directly to the principle of equality in the Declaration. What does equality mean? It means we're neither angels nor beasts. We're in between. And that means that we have to have a government, and it too has to be controlled. Every delegation of human power in the doctrine of the American Revolution should be checked in a way to keep it from getting out of hand. And that means private things too. That means predatory, thieves, for example, or Google and Amazon censoring our speech, claiming not to, right? Those are threats to our freedom, and they should be stopped. And then the government consorting with that, and the government itself. There's an order coming out about college kids, about sexual harassment charges. And they are, if you take the federal money, which I'm proud we don't do, you'll be required to use a standard of proof that's well below knowing they're guilty, right? And that means you're going to harm some people without being as sure as in a court of law that they did the dirty deed. And that's just not, being a man, I freely admit that men are much less reliable than women, but not all women are all reliable. So
don't spread that word. Don't let that word get out.
Yeah, that's it. There's a fever in the air. There's blood in the water right now, and it's a dangerous time for our country.
Well, I hate to say this, but our time is just about up. So before we end and I close, Dr. Arnn, would you give us your last thoughts on this extremely important subject?
Well, I have two. The first is how fine to be with old friends. And you, Joellen, are amazing to me because you look like you did 35 years ago.
Oops.
And then
she was only 7 years old when you met her, though.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Orange County is a cool thing too. I spent a lot of time down there when I lived in Southern California, and it's good to be connected to all the old friends who might be watching this. And then finally, it's time now that we think through and act in order to save our country. It's one of those times in American history. And I think Orange County is the most likely place for such a thing to start. outside, I will say, Hillsdale, Michigan. So you guys do it.
Dr. Arnn, may I say, first of all, thank you for joining us and spending your time with us. And all you can do is what we can do. I think that we as citizens have an obligation to do several things. Yes, to vote, be an educated voter, to pay our taxes. They're too high, but that's a different issue. But the other is to make the system work. It's our government. You and Hillsdale College are doing that, and I appreciate it, and we thank you. And let me just show that you have this, see if I can get it up there, this impremens that you send out. Thank you, and for doing that. I receive it, and it gives great thoughts. So we appreciate you. And Joe Ellen is going to mention our next session. We were talking about James Madison and If Men Were Angels. Joe Ellen will probably talk about that in a moment. It will be our 4th session. Hard to match, hard to follow up on you, but thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. And I would like to say that Dr. Arnn and Hillsdale College put out a number of free courses online. You just have to go to Hillsdale College. The website will come up. And they have a great program that you can watch online or you can get on disc on Constitution. It's called Constitution 101. And I would highly encourage you to look at any of the programs that they have. They're fundamental to our history and our philosophy as Americans, really, and as just as people. If you want to hear all of the songs on Convention, the songs written by Judge Jim Gray and his 2 composers, just go to judgejimgray.com and you can listen to all of the songs, not just the one that we heard this morning. And then if you want a day-by-day account of what happened at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, just log on to Concordia University, Irvine, Center for Public Policy. It will pop up and you'll get a day-by-day account of what happened, be introduced to the men who wrote this document and the issues that they face. Next time, we're going to have a very unique guest. We're going to actually talk with President James Madison in person. It's one you're not going to want to miss. See you next time.